Today we're going to focus on adding movement to our character's attacks. So currently, when we run the game and we attack, if we're not moving, the character doesn't move, and if we are moving, the character maintains that velocity for the entire attack. So today we're going to create our movement weapon component that is responsible for defining how our character moves for different attacks, and how we integrate that with our animation event system. So welcome to Barden, my name is Heinrich, and let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is create that movement weapon component that is responsible for all of this. So let's go ahead and come to our IDE, and let's open up our File Explorer. And the first thing I want to do is come down to our weapons folder, and then in the components folder, right click, go ahead and say add, and we're going to add a Unity script. I'm going to call this class simply movement. Now, one thing to note is we already have a movement core component over here. And when we created the core components, we were not making use of namespaces just yet. So we need to go ahead and add a namespace to our core components so that our project doesn't get confused between the core component movement and the weapon component movement. So the way you do this will be very IDE dependent. I'm using Writer, so I'm going to do it the Writer way. But just go ahead and Google how to refactor namespaces for the IDE that you're using, be it Visual Studio Code or just Visual Studio or whatever else you're using. So in Writer, what I can do is I can come to, say, my core script, right-click on that, and then say refactor this. And I say I want to adjust the namespaces. So I click on that. It's going to ask which files I want to adjust the namespaces for. And currently I want to do just the core component. I'm then going to go ahead and say next. And if I open the core class now, you can see that it's changed the namespace to barden._scripts.core. Now I want this to just be barden.core, like that. Actually, let's not delete it that way because it's changed the references in other places. So what I can do is I can hit F2 on this to rename it, and then I can just get rid of .scripts over here. So now it's just barden.core, and everywhere else where the core is being used, it has included using barden.core in the using statements at the top. Next, let's take a look at our core components. So let's just click on core component. You can see this one still doesn't have a namespace. So now what I can do is right click on my folder and say refactor this and say adjust namespaces again. And I want to do all of these. So if I just go ahead and say next there, you can see all of these have been adjusted as well. But now the namespace is again barden._scripts.core.core components. I want it to just be barden.core again. I'm going to just click on core components, hit F2 again, and I'm going to adjust it to just be barden.core. Like that. So now all of these core components should be in the barden.core namespace. And that way, now over here with movement, it is not going to get confused between the two. Okay, so that's the first thing taken care of. I can go ahead and close the File Explorer over there. Now, let's talk about how the movement weapon component is going to work. What's going to happen is we can specify animation events in the weapon animations that is going to tell the weapon to start movement and stop movement. Simple as that. So on this frame, I want the character to start moving, and on this frame, it needs to stop moving. So to do this, that means we're going to first need to create the two animation events for start and stop movement, and then our movement weapon component is going to need to hook in to our AnimationEventHandler to listen for those events. So let's start by coming to our AnimationEventHandler over here. And let's go ahead and create two new events. So public event action. And the first one is going to be on start movement. And the second public event action is going to be on stop movement. And it's action. Okay. So these are the two events that our weapon movement component is going to listen to. And now we just need to create the two functions that the animation itself can actually call. So the first one is private void, and I'm going to call it start movement trigger. And all this is going to do is on start movement, null coalescing operator, invoke. And this is trigger. Next, we have another private void, stop movement. trigger. And this is just going to say on stop movement invoke. Okay, so this is how our weapon animations is going to tell our weapon to start or stop movement, like I mentioned. Next, we need to give our movement weapon component access to this. So currently our sprite weapon component isn't making use of the animation event handler, so we haven't set up our weapon components to access this yet. So let's go ahead and do that. We need to go ahead and come to our weapon component script. And then in here, we just need to go ahead and look at our weapon, look for the animation event handler that is stored there, and simply pass on the reference. So I can say protected animation event handler, and I'll just call it event handler with a capital E, because this is simply going to say weapon dot event handler, which it seems that we don't have access to this yet. Let's go take a look at that. So if we control click on weapon, this weapon, it should take us to our weapon script. And you can see over here we have our animation event handler, but it is currently private. So let's go ahead and rename this to event handler with a capital E, and then let's make it public. And then don't forget to give it a public getter and a private setter. Okay, so that means back in our animation event handler, in our weapon component script, this now works. So that means if we now come back to our movement component, over here, if we, instead of inheriting from mono behavior, inherit from our weapon component class, we should have access to the event handler. So what we now need to do is we need to go ahead and create two handler functions that is going to handle when those events get invoked. So our first one is going to be private void handle start movement. The function has no input parameters. And then our second function is private void handle stop movement. And these are the two functions that we're going to subscribe to those two events that we just created. And we're going to do that in our onEnable and onDisable functions. So let's start by overriding our onEnable function. And then in here we can say event handler dot onStartMovement plus equals handle start movement, and event handler dot onStopMovement plus equals handle stop movement. Next, we just need to do the same for our onDisable function. So we'll say override onDisable, and in here we simply can copy and paste this and change it from plus equals to minus equals. Like that. So now whenever those animation events get called, we will call these two functions. Okay, so with our movement weapon component created, we need to create the data for this movement component like we did for the sprite component in the earlier episodes. So let's go ahead and open up our file explorer again. And you can see here we have a component data folder and an attack data folder. Let's start with the attack data folder. Right click on that, say add normal C# class, and we want to create a class called attack movement. So again, this is going to be a class that defines what the data looks like for a single attack. So what information do we need to move the character for one of its sword swings? So in here, what kind of data do we want to have for our attack movement? Now, I want to be able to specify a direction that our character moves in for an attack, and then also a velocity. So for example, a sword swing could move the character forward, but the third sword attack where the character swings the sword from lower upwards, so like an uppercut sword swing, for this attack I want to give the character a slight bounce. So I might want to specify a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to start with a public vector2, and I'm going to call it direction, and give it a public getter and a private setter. And then I'm also going to create a public float, and this is simply the velocity with a public getter and a private setter. Now again, to make sure that we can see this in the inspector, we need to remember to come up to the top over here and say serializable, which is in the system namespace. And then we also, in front of each one of our variables, need to say field serialize field. So with this created, we can go ahead and come back to our File Explorer, and then in our component data folder, let's go ahead and right click on that, hit Add, New C# class, and this one is just going to be called MovementData. Now in here, because this is the data for a specific weapon component, we need to make sure that we inherit from component data. That way we can go ahead and add this to the list in the scriptable object. And in here, all we need to do is create a field, serialize field, and then create a public attack movement, which is the class that we just created, array, because we have one of those for each one of our attacks, and we'll just call it attack data. And then don't forget the public getter and the private setter. So now for our new movement weapon component to make use of this data, our component is going to need access to the player's core component. And if you didn't follow the player controller series, I'll quickly explain just a little bit about how this works. So let's come back to Unity. And in here, if we take a look at our player in the hierarchy, you can see that we have this core game object that has this core script attached to it. Now, as a child to the core, we have a bunch of core components. Over here, you can see the movement one that we had to change the namespaces for. So this movement script is simply a collection of a bunch of functions that our character can make use of to move in different ways, and just kind of centralizes this logic so that we can just add this core component to any other entity if we want similar movement logic. So in this case, for this movement core component, it's quite simple currently, but we have a bunch of set functions over here to do various things. So we can set velocity to 0, we can set velocity at a specific angle and a facing direction, or just various other set velocity functions. If we only want to set the velocity in the x direction, set the velocity in the y direction, things like that. So this is what the core system is supposed to help us with. So because this is what we use to move our player, our weapon system needs to have access to this movement core component. And the way that is done is by just making use of the normal core script over here, and then using this getCoreComponent function to find a core component on that entity. So to start off, the reference we need is a reference to this core component. So let's go ahead and come back to our weapon script over here. Let's start off by creating a variable to hold our core. So after the AnimationEventHandler, I'm going to create a public core called core and give it a public getter and a private setter. Now over here, this is giving us an issue because we renamed that namespace. So now it's core.core. I actually don't like that. So we might have an issue with the fact that our namespace is the same name as the script. So over here, instead of barden.core, I'm going to rename core to core system, like that. That way we can come back to our weapon script. And now over here, you can see it says core system.core, but we can get rid of core system and then simply add using core system at the top here. So just so you know, probably in other places in the code, it probably changed it to core system.core. You can just fix those when you see them. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really affect anything. This is just nicer to read. Okay, so with this core variable created, let's go ahead and just create a dedicated function to set the core. So we'll just say public void set core, and this needs to take in a core called core, like that. So now we can say core just equals core. Now we could have just made the setter public to do this, but just in case we want to do some other logic whenever the core changes, let's just keep it this way. So now with this set core function, we need a place to call this from. And in this case, it makes sense to call it from the player script because our player gets the reference to the weapons to pass it on to the attack states. So, and the player already has access to its own core. So let's go ahead and open up our File Explorer, and then let's come up to our player folder, player finite state machine, and then player.cs. Close the File Explorer. And now if we look at our variables real quick, so here is the reference to the core that we want to go ahead and pass on. If we take a look at our awake function, over here we get the reference to our two weapons that's in the hierarchy. So after we've done that, and make sure that's also after we get the reference to the core, here we can say primary weapon dot set core, and we just pass in core like that. And then secondary weapon dot set core, pass in core. Okay, so now that our weapon knows which core it needs to look at, we can go ahead and pass that on to our movement weapon component. So let's go ahead and open up our file explorer, come back to our weapons folder, and in here we can once again come to our weapon component script. So we can just do the same thing that we did for our animation event handler. So we just say protected core, call it core, and all this does is say weapon.core, like that. And then we just need to make sure we remember to add our using statement at the top. Okay, so now that we have this reference to our core component, let's go ahead and come back to our movement component over here. And now we can make use of the core in our handle functions. So the first thing we need a reference to our movement core component. So over here, we can create a private movement, but remember that our class that we're currently in is also called movement. Now, a very simple solution would be to just call this weapon movement, but this is the whole reason we're using namespaces. You can do whatever you want, but in this case, you can see over here we can select bardent.core system movement, and if we click that, then now it's specifying core system.movement. And in this case, we can't get away from using core system because we need to be able to specify which movement we are talking about. So if we just say movement in this class, it's going to reference itself. But if we say core system.movement, we are referencing the movement core component. So with that, I'm just going to call this core movement. Then we need to be able to set this reference. And again, if you didn't come from the player controller series, the way this is done is by creating another variable, private core system.movement. And I'm going to call it core movement with a capital C this time. And what this is going to do is we say core movement, question mark, core movement, colon, core dot get core component with a reference to our core movement. So what this is basically doing is we're checking to see if our core movement is null or not over here. And if it's not null, we simply return it. And if it is null, meaning we haven't set the reference yet, we then say core.getCoreComponent with a reference to this core movement variable. And now that we have access to this core movement script, we can now use those functions to move the player. But before we can do that, we also need to give our movement weapon component access to its data. So underneath this, let's go ahead and declare a private movement data, and we'll simply call it data like that. And then in our handle start movement function, we can say var current attack data equals data dot attack data, which is the array that holds all the attacks data. And we want the weapon dot current attack counters data. And then after that, we can go ahead and say core movement dot set velocity, which is one of the functions that we have in that script. And we want to use this first one where we can pass in a velocity and an angle and a direction. And the reason there is an angle and a direction is because, say we want to move the character at a 45-degree angle, we always want to do that in the direction the character is facing. We don't want 45 to always mean to the right and up. So in here we can then say current attack data dot velocity, then current attack data dot direction as the angle, and the direction we want is our core movement dot facing direction, which keeps track of the current direction the character is facing. Simple as that. We can then come to our handle stop movement function, and all we need to do in here is say core movement dot set velocity 0. So now one last thing that we have left to do in here is we need to set the reference to our movement data, and we do that in our awake function. So over here, let's say override awake. And then after base.awake, we can say data equals weapon.data.getData, and the data type that we're looking for is movement data. Okay, so with that done, now all we need is a way to add this to our list of weapon data in the scriptable object. So let's open up our file explorer. Let's come up to our scriptable objects folder and then weapon data SO. And in here, we are currently just using a context menu button to add a certain type. Again, this is temporary. We're going to write some code later on to automatically find all of these via reflection and create a list of buttons for us. But for now, let's just go ahead and copy this, paste it down here, and instead of sprite data, it's going to be add movement data. And same thing for the function, so add movement data. And then all this does is component data.add new movement data, like that. You can see over here, it's complaining about our component data name because it's lowercase in the front. So let's F2 on that and change it to component data, just like that. Okay, so with that created, we're ready to come back to Unity. And now in here, if we come to our data folder and then look at our sort1, it seems that we have lost our sprite data. So what's going on with that? Oh, I know what it is. It's because we renamed component data from lowercase c to uppercase c. So the scribble object asset no longer recognizes that. But I'll show you a little trick. If we come back to our editor real quick, over here, and let's open up our file explorer. If we find our data folder over here, you can see we have our sort_1.asset and sort_2. Let's open that and just take a look at what it looks like. Now, this is a YAML file, and you can see over here it says this file is internal to Unity and should not be edited manually. But that is more of a suggestion. We can go ahead and edit it manually just a little bit. Let's go ahead and look over here. You can see that there is data, and here is a sprites backing field, and here's all the sprites that we added for that attack. So what we just need to do is somewhere it references that variable, the component data variable that we created, and it still thinks it's a lowercase c. So what we can just do is Control F and say component data. You can see there's one result over here, and let's just rename that to a capital C and save it. Again, let's come to our sort2 and just do the same thing. So it's in the same place, change that to a capital C, save it, and we'll just pretend that Unity doesn't know any better. If we come back to Unity now, you'll see there is our element 0 again with all of our sprites. So just keep this in mind when you do refactor variable names, your asset might lose the reference and you might have to go edit some YAML files manually, but the YAML file might also update and you might lose it. So keep backups of your project. GitHub is the way to go. So with our sprites restored, let's go ahead and add our movement data. Let's start with sort1, come up to the right, hit the options menu here and say add movement data. Go ahead and expand this and add 3 elements for our 3 different attacks. For attack 0, I want the direction to be straightforward, so x equals 1, y equals 0, and the velocity is simply going to be 3. For element 2, again the same thing. I want the direction to be forward, and the velocity this time is going to be 4. Then for our third attack, I want the direction to be 1 on the x, but quite straight up, so maybe something like 5 on the y. Then the velocity, I'm going to make 5 as well. We can see what that looks like. And for our sort2, I'm going to have exactly the same data. So what I can do is just copy this, click on attack data and say copy, then come to a sort2, go ahead and add the movement data to the list, and then come to our attack data over here, right click and just say paste. Now both sorts have the same movement data. Perfect, but now before we can completely test it, we have 2 more things to do. We need to add this movement component to our 2 game objects. So let's just select both of them, hit add component, and we want movement, which I'm not sure which one it is. This is something else I need to figure out, is how we can differentiate them here. But I think it's this one. Let's go ahead and just open it. Yep, barden.weapons.components. Perfect. Okay. So now both weapons have this movement component. And then the next thing we have left to do is to add our animation events. So if we open up our primary weapon and then click on the base game object, we can now come to our animation tab. And in here we can go ahead and look at all our animations and add the events. So what I want to do is at the very first frame, I want to stop the character's movement. So just add an animation event and then come to the inspector And I'm actually just going to move the inspector down here for now, just so there's a little less editing for me to do. So we add an animation at the very first frame, click on the functions dropdown and select stop movement. Then I want to start movement when we swing, so on this frame over here. So add another event, go to the functions dropdown and say start movement. And then I want to stop the movement when we start retracting our sword over here. So add another animation event and say stop movement. And just do the same thing for the other two animations as well. Okay, so with all those animation events added, we should be ready to start testing. So let's go ahead and run the game and let's see what happens. Okay, we have some errors. Let's see what is going on. So we have an issue with our onEnable function in our weapon movement component. So I think I know what the issue is. It's probably again that our onEnable is getting called before our component knows about our event handler. So, or before our weapon knows about the event handler, which is where we're going to get that information. So again, later on, this isn't going to be an issue because our weapon is going to be initialized before the weapon components. But for now, let's go ahead and come to our weapon component. And I guess instead of doing this, let's just find the reference ourselves. It's simply finding it in children. So I'm going to copy this and then comment this one out and paste it again. And now instead of passing on our weapon.eventHandler, and then let's rename this to a lowercase e event handler, like that. And then in our awake function, let's simply go ahead and say event handler equals get component in children. And the component type that we're looking for is our animation event handler. And then let's just leave ourselves a little note here to do fix this when finishing weapon data. Because when we do that is where we're going to ensure that our weapon gets initialized first. But with that, I guess we should be ready to test again. Let's, fingers crossed, there's nothing else. Let's run the game and let's see what happens. Okay, so I think these are old errors because I don't have clear on play selected. Let's see what happens. There we go. If we attack, you can see our character moves. So if we're running and we attack, our character stops first and then performs the attack. And you can see that our movement happens when we want it to. And we also have that little hop when the character swings upwards. Perfect, just like that. So that is our weapon movement component. Now, again, you're not limited to this. You could expand this movement component to do so much more. Maybe you have multiple movement directions for a single attack. Maybe you have a giant hammer that swings upwards and throws the characters in the air before swinging back down. So you have multiple triggers along the way, and you are free to create events that are only used by one weapon. You don't have to generalize everything for as many weapons as possible. So while that is good to be able to reduce the amount of work that you need to do to create a bunch of weapons, if you have an idea for a very specific weapon, the code can be completely custom for that weapon. And that's what's nice about this weapon system, is you can just plug and play things that you need. But yep, that does it for the movement component. In the next episode, we're going to take a deeper look at our weapon component data and how we can generalize that a bit further to reduce the amount of work that we need to do every time we create a new component. But that's going to do it for this episode. Again, if you'd like access to the prototype that I'm using for this series early, you can get that on my Patreon as any tier. And with that mentioned, I'd just like to say thank you to all of my supporters and wonderful people over on Patreon. And a huge special thank you to Cody Lee, SM, Madras Sins, Jake Skarupa, Atami, Mike Rodriguez, and Nathan Ackley. You guys are absolute mad lads, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.